So Dr. Sengupta, thank you so much for speaking to us on Turning the Page, and many congratulations on your book, Sing, Dance and Pray, the inspirational story of Srila Prabhupada, Founder-Acharya of ISKCON. And this is one among many biographies that you've authored. So in fact, let me just begin by asking you about why you chose this fascinating personality as the subject of your latest book.
Thank you, Siddhartha. What a pleasure and delight to be with you on your wonderful channel. Big fan of all the work that you guys do. Thank you for choosing to talk about Srila Prabhupada and Sing, Dance and Pray, my new book. Let me give you some perspective. One of the core work that I do is as a historian of religion. There aren't too many people who do that work in India, but that's in a sense one of my specializations, right? I look at history, its context, especially to do with religion, and most specifically to do with Hinduism. If you look at the trajectory of my work from being Hindu to the modern monk, which is the book I wrote on Swami Vivekananda, then of course elements of that in the book I wrote on Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, the man who saved India, and now of course in this book, Sing, Dance and Pray on Srila Prabhupada, and also in the historical fiction that I wrote on Guru Govind Singh. You look at the broad arc of my work, and it looks at trying to understand Hinduism and its affiliate religions in a sense, and in all their contexts and their nuances, right? One of the things, Siddhartha, that I've been interested in for a long time is something called global Hinduism, right? Which tries to understand how Hinduism had an impact not just in India, but around the world. Who were its dramatis personae? How did it spread around the world? What is the reception that it received, and how it sort of absorbed that reception and accommodated it, right? That is the history that I'm interested in. And you would understand, Siddhartha, that one of the seminal figures in global Hinduism, of course, is Swami Vivekananda. But after Swami Vivekananda, if you look at the person who's had the biggest footfall, so to speak, or the footprint, it is Srila Prabhupada. Nobody has had a bigger impact than Srila Prabhupada on around the world by spreading Hinduism, right? So he becomes a seminal, or he is a seminal figure in the history of global Hinduism. Srila Prabhupada, of course, is an intriguing figure because unlike many others, Srila Prabhupada only begins his journey of spreading Hinduism in the West at the age of 70. It is an age which I often tell my audiences, most people are far more busy talking about or describing their arthritis than spreading and building a global movement. So Srila Prabhupada is an intriguing figure who begins his journey so late, and yet in the next 11 years, and he's only alive for about 11 years after he arrives in America at the age of 70, Srila Prabhupada then proceeds to build a global movement which attracts everybody from Allen Ginsberg to George Harrison. And, you know, I'm sure you'll ask me about these things, so I will not go into greater detail at this answer. But he builds truly a global movement, 108 temples around the world in 11 years, building one of the greatest and the biggest footprints of Hinduism ever constructed. And that's why Srila Prabhupada is a very intriguing figure for me as a historian.
And he's intriguing for a lot of the reasons that you've already mentioned. And I'll come to his time in the United States and his propagation of Krishna consciousness and the kind of following that it acquired within very short span of time upon him reaching the US. But let's also talk about the times that he grew up in India. He was born in 1896. And he was actually witness to a time of great political ferment in the country. Though you describe him as somebody in your book as somebody who is not acutely political, I think that's the exact word that you use. But nevertheless, he did have some strong political views on the issues of the day. And let me, in fact, begin by talking about the distinction that he draws between the non-violence that was propagated by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi and the approach that one of his other contemporaries, Subhash Chandra Bose, actually took, because he was of the view that it was the formation of the INA and the growing apprehension about the INA within British ranks that in fact sped up the movement for independence, as opposed to the non-violent approach that Mr. Gandhi had taken. If you could just give us a perspective about the kind of political views that shaped his personality as well, and the backdrop and the context in which he kind of grew up in and was witness to some very significant moments in our history.
That's right, Siddharth. This has been one of the most interesting things that I have discovered through the course of writing this book. You see, Srila Prabhupada and even Vivekananda before, then many other figures like that are seen in isolation as two-dimensional characters only through the lenses of their spiritual fervor, right? But that's, of course, not correct at all, as you would understand as a journalist, and as, of course, I understand as a historian. They're very much products of their time. See, once they're deified, Siddharth, we lose all nuances to these characters, right? But as a historian, it is my job to look at them in their context, so to speak. And what is Srila Prabhupada's context? He's almost, a contemporary of Subhash Chandra Bose. He's studying in colleges in Calcutta, which are, ripe with the ferment of nationalism and anti-colonialism. He sees around him people responding to the Gandhian call of giving up Western clothing, right? It's impossible. And I thought to myself, it's impossible that Srila Prabhupada wouldn't have responded to all of this, right? I mean, who wouldn't at that time, right? And indeed he did, right? And he had strong views about non-violence, Gandhian non-violence versus the Subhash Chandra Bose approach. And today historians talk about this, but I think Srila Prabhupada, being a sort of fountainhead of wisdom that he was in many ways, saw this early, that to argue, as has been argued perhaps in India post-independence, that only Gandhian non-violence won us independence is a rather limiting point of view. The story is far more rich, it is far more nuanced, it has far more elements to it, right? On how India won its freedom is not a story that we can only tell in terms of Gandhian non-violence. And in that sense, what historians are talking about today, Srila Prabhupada saw all those years ago, right? And he realized, and today we talk about the fact that, had there not been the Second World War, had there not been the naval mutiny, had there not been the British fear, really a terrifying fear, because of course they remembered the mutiny of 1857, that they would lose control of the navies on the shores of India, and they would lose control of the armies, the soldiers who were all Indian and were commanded by British officers, that would have accentuated the British desire to quickly leave India. We forget the naval mutiny, Siddharth, where the British and naval power realized that they could not anymore really trust the naval officers, the Indian naval officers, and the naval personnel who commanded their ships of the shores of Bombay. All of this triggered the heightened and the quick exit of the British from India. Now, all of this we talk about as historians today, but Srila Prabhupada was prescient in seeing all of this much earlier, right? And he realized that Subhash Chandra Bose's appeal to create an armed resistance to the British colonialism was in fact as much potent as Gandhian nonviolence. Also remember, Srila Prabhupada comes from a time when he was seeing this armed revolution ferment in Bengal, at a time of the Anushilan Samiti, of the Hindu Mela, and all these organizations, the revolutionary, in Bengali, it's called the Agni Yug, the age of fire, right? All this revolutionary fervent in Bengal, which, and I've mentioned some of it, a great robbery, not a bank robbery, but a great arms robbery. I mentioned that in the book to give you context of what he's reading, what he's seeing, all the ferment that he's seeing around him. And therefore, he's very prescient in pointing out that it is limiting to say that only Gandhian nonviolence won us our freedom. And in that, Srila Prabhupada plays a little bit of a role as a prescient soothsayer, a prescient historian himself, to try and understand our national movement in greater context.
And I would also urge you, Dr. Sengupta, to take our viewers through that extremely interesting letter that he wrote to Mr. Gandhi, almost on the eve of Gandhi's assassination. This was after
Yes.
we'd won our freedom. But Mr. Prabhupada was also of the view that this victory that we've achieved was in many ways an incomplete project. And he goes to the extent of, in fact, telling Mr. Gandhi to renounce politics altogether and take up the full-time propagation of the Bhagavad Gita. If you could just give our viewers a bit of context about that and why he said what he said to Mr. Gandhi.
Fascinating. I'm so glad you picked up on that, Siddharth. It's a very, very interesting letter. And it's a very, very, this letter has barely been spoken of, and you'll barely find a lot of mention of this in other sort of material on Srila Prabhupada. But I think it's a very, very interesting letter. Why is it a very interesting letter? Again, today historians talk about this, right? That perhaps Gandhi should have stepped away from politics when India received independence, right? And he should have left the real politics to his acolytes. And we know from history that that was already happening. Both Sardar Patel and Jawaharlal Nehru, two of the greatest acolytes of Gandhi, actually in many ways, would have agreed with Srila Prabhupada that perhaps Gandhi's role was more as a spiritual leader by the time India gets its independence, right? But Srila Prabhupada realizes that if Gandhi adopts a particular political role far beyond its usability, so to speak, for India, then he himself is limiting his own use for India. And he believes that, and very interestingly, he believes, today we talk about how while India got independence and did great things, and there's no doubt about it, there was a certain moral core that shifted in India, right? After all, 1 million people were butchered during partition, all kinds of terrible things happened. So moral core shifted in India, right? And that moral core was very important. Srila Prabhupada, of course, as a Krishna Bhakti person, talks about this in terms of Krishna Bhakti and says, unless that spiritual core is retained in India, until that moral, if you want to put it in secular terms, until that or unless that moral core is made secure, the perimeters are sort of sanctified, and that remains the core of the Indian nationhood, there will be problems in society. And we know there were, right? I mean, India's degradation in moral and ethical terms is no surprise, to anyone, far less your viewers. We all know this from history and how the downfall of Indian institutions happened, how the downfall of Indian, morals and ethics in society happened. And therefore, Srila Prabhupada is saying Gandhi is one of the greatest propagators of the Bhagavad Gita, perhaps ever in its history, right? And Gandhi has a real role to bring the Gita and its moral lesson and make it as the core of India's independent nationhood. So far more than in politics, Gandhi has that role to play. And Srila Prabhupada presciently points out that Gandhi ought to play this role. Now, of course, his words were not heeded. And of course, as you point out, very soon Gandhi was assassinated for political reasons, right? But Gandhi's role, which Srila Prabhupada envisaged as a keeper of India's spiritual consciousness, was invaluable. And perhaps in some ways, Gandhi should have listened and paid attention to that letter that Srila Prabhupada wrote.
And Srila Prabhupada, of course, was heavily influenced by Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, his guru. And therefore, that begs the question, because Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati was of the view that the propagation of Krishna consciousness or the greatness of Krishna should extend beyond national borders. And he was also of the view that nationalism, purely going by geographical considerations, might be a limiting sentiment or a limiting emotion. So therefore, to that extent, is that a view that Srila Prabhupada also shared? Because clearly his project was not confined to India. It extended well beyond India's boundaries, something that he realized once he, of course, went to the United States and was able to successfully propagate his ideas there.
In order to understand this, Siddharth, I think we should understand this in a slightly broader context. When the philosophies of Hinduism, and Vaishnavism, of course, is deeply part of Hinduism, right? When the philosophies and philosophers of Hinduism were conceptualizing their universe, should I say, they did not conceptualize their universe with national boundaries, right? If you look at the wisdom of the Vedas, if you look at the great Upanishadic knowledge, nowhere are they saying that this knowledge should be confined in Bharat, right? They are saying this knowledge is for every living being. And mark my words, every living being, not just human beings, right? This knowledge and this wisdom applies to everything that is living. The entire universe, right, is sort of subsumed in this wisdom, right? So therefore, while Srila Prabhupada had great, and remember, Srila Prabhupada could have lived on in America, but in many senses, it was his love for his country that brought him back to finally, give up his bodily self, so to speak, in Vrindavan, right? It is that there that he felt that it was his, it was his natural home, so to speak, in the sacred land of Vrindavan, right? Now, my obviously, when he thought of Krishna consciousness, and that's my point, when he thought of Krishna consciousness, he understood that it would be quite limiting to think of it only using India's borders. Because remember, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu onwards, the great Vaishnavites have said that there would be the name of Krishna would ring in every street and every town square around the world, right? Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati himself, told Srila Prabhupada that this was his moral duty to spread the word everywhere. So therefore, we have to understand it in the context of Srila Prabhupada, but also in the deeper context of Hinduism, that these philosophies were never constructed as a national philosophy, right? They came from the sacred land, so to speak, but they were never envisaged to be only confined to Indians or to India. So in that sense, there is a broader vision always, and it encompasses not just India or the rest of the world, but it encompasses the entire known universe, so to speak, right? Because that's the foundational message of Upanishadic wisdom upon which all of Hinduism, in a sense, stands, right? And that's important to remember. And that's why Srila Prabhupada, while being a deep sort of, a deep patriot of India and wanting always to spread the word in India, he realized that he was not having a breakthrough moment in India. So when he goes abroad, quite like Vivekananda, goes abroad, gets all this fame, comes back to India and begins to build in India too, in Vrindavan, in Mayapur, in Mumbai, and so on and so forth, right? So you see that the vision is not confined to in India, but India is never abandoned. India remains the core. India remains the spiritual heart, right? And that is never left.
And why is it? Because he lands in the United States. Of course, he goes by ship, and he arrives in the United
Has
States.
two heart attacks in the ship, as you of course read.
Yeah, he had two heart attacks, and
Yes.
and he suffered from seasickness, and that itself was an ordeal.
Right.
And once he arrives in the United States, it takes him barely 2 years to acquire a serious following, something that he tried doing in India for a long period of time, but was not able to succeed. Give our viewers a perspective, Dr. Sengupta, of why that mission in India did not succeed prior to him leaving for the United States.
That's right. Excellent question once again. I think Srila Prabhupada did not make headway because there were many Vaishnavite institutions that were already in, various levels of institutionalization. There were already people who were working there. Maybe some of them were in states of disrepair. It's a classic Indian story. Here was an innovator, right? He was an enterprising person wanting to bring through a breakthrough in that world. But that's never easy to do in India, especially in religion. Also, the other thing is very important. Srila Prabhupada was a disruptor. And we know that religious institutions and religious organizations don't take well to disruption, especially if they've been there for a long time, right? In America, he found fertile ground. America was already going through one of its deepest crises in its political history, right? The Vietnam War had, torn the country apart. In fact, some of the repercussions of what happened in the anti-Vietnam War protests are alive in India, in America even today. The seed of those divisions are alive in America even today. And in a sense, Srila Prabhupada saw those divisions unfurl in a sense for the first time, right? If you look at those divisions from the civil rights movement, but before that, the American Civil War, the anti-Vietnam protests, and of course today, the same fissures appear in American society again and again, right? So Srila Prabhupada was talking to people who wanted a different message. And he had a different message to offer. And who did he offer it to? I find it incredible that some of his first followers were hippies from Upper East Side, Lower East Side, so to speak, in New York, often intoxicated. And that's why, one of my chapters talks about the high of Krishna. ISKCON went and told them that you don't need any other high. You have the high of Krishna, so to speak, right? But it's very important to realize that this message was falling on very fertile ground. Here was an entire movement of millions of people who wanted a different message, who were not convinced by the materialism, the warmongering, all of that was so intrinsic to America's idea of itself. And they wanted a different message. And Srila Prabhupada provided it. I often tell my audiences, think about it. In San Francisco, there were these giant festivals that were happening, musical festivals, right? Which doubled up as musical festivals and anti-Vietnam War protests, right? Srila Prabhupada goes and tells them, we have an even greater festival to offer you. And we have a festival that will offer you salvation. What is that festival? From Jagannath Puri, Srila Prabhupada takes the Rath Yatra, right? And the Rath Yatra is the greatest musical grand spectacle San Francisco has ever seen, right? It's nothing like these people have ever seen. So obviously you can see that here is a man who's embracing people and saying the answer is God, the answer is love, something that Americans understand, right? I point out in my book to that wonderful video, William Buckley Jr. versus Allen Ginsberg, right?
I was in fact going to come to that. I was in fact going to come to that in just a couple of minutes.
So I will not go into details of that, but epic moments on American television, you as a journalist would know that so well. Everybody knows that moment. But what an impact of Srila Prabhupada even in that moment.
In fact, since you brought up Allen Ginsberg, it begs the question. Now, Allen Ginsberg was a very important recruit, so to speak, to the Krishna consciousness cause. And right. He, in fact, was pivotal in the movement acquiring the kind of potency and momentum that it did. Right. And what's really interesting about Allen Ginsberg here is that he's somebody who was known to be anti-establishment in every possible aspect, okay. Anti-materialism. So therefore, to find a spiritual calling was in itself quite ironic for a personality of his nature. And this is something that somebody like Christopher Hitchens has also described, the idea of a fear of God or the idea of a complete submission before a certain deity. He calls it a celestial dictatorship. And it would not be very difficult to divorce somebody like Ginsberg as well from that kind of a perspective about the idea of a supreme deity. How did somebody like Allen Ginsberg ended up reconciling to this idea of complete submission that was propagated by Srila Prabhupada? How did he come to embrace somebody like a Srila Prabhupada, where at least superficially it would come across as two individuals having completely divergent views about submission before God?
I think the answer to that question, again, a very interesting question, Siddhartha. The answer to that question is the way Allen Ginsberg saw it. There were two kinds of submissions on offer. One was a submission to the political dictatorship of materialism and, most importantly, the military establishment complex, right? The military industrial complex, right? The military industrial complex, along with materialism, had its own dictatorship, so to speak. Allen Ginsberg was leading, in a sense, the movement against the dictatorship of this entire military industrial complex, of this entire materialism-driven approach, and saying another way was possible. Srila Prabhupada was saying that other way is to submit to a divine love. And remember, love was a very important potent word of that time, because at that time in the anti-Vietnam War protests, there were these huge love festivals that were happening. It was the summer of free love, right? Srila Prabhupada was saying, all of you are talking about love at a particular level, but there is a deeper love to be had, right? And that is the love of the divine. And that love doesn't define, doesn't keep away anyone. It embraces everyone. And you can see how people like Allen Ginsberg at that moment, it would have sounded radical to them. It wouldn't have sounded conservative to them. It would have sounded radical to them. Because Srila Prabhupada, remember, was going in telling people, you can have a better life. You can have better food, cleaner food. You can have, a deeper commitment to even to your partner, right? Either you embrace chastity or at least you embrace faithfulness to your partner, right? And you don't have to confine your existence to materialism, to material needs and war, consistent, endless war. So it's a radical message. In the years of Allen Ginsberg at that moment, this is a radical message. So in the conversation with William Buckley Jr., at one point when they're arguing, Allen Ginsberg just said, you're not even understanding what I'm saying. So therefore, maybe you'll understand this. And he takes out a little harmonium and starts to sing Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. William Buckley Jr. says, what is this? What kind of music is this? And he says, this is essentially the love of God. And even you, who's my intellectual opponent in every way, can access this love of God. It's an incredible moment. It is an incredible moment. It's a wonder that we don't talk about this moment more often. But I think it's an incredible moment. You want to call it the soft power of India, you want to call it global Hinduism. It's an incredible moment. It is as potent a moment as Swami Vivekananda standing up at the Parliament of Religions and talking about it. Because remember, at least Swami Vivekananda was an Indian. Allen Ginsberg is no Indian, right? So it's a wonderful seminal moment, which I thought should be highlighted.
In fact, you reproduced that specific exchange between Will Buckley Jr. and Allen Ginsberg. You reproduce the transcript. And the first instinct, of course, upon having read that was to go on YouTube and see the video. That specific excerpt is actually there on YouTube for everybody to see.
That's right.
Strongly encourage our viewers to have a look at it. And one thing that stands out, of course, is the mesmerizing tone in which Allen Ginsberg recites Hare Rama, Hare Krishna. And then, of course, the spellbound reaction of Will Buckley Jr. He's completely silent. He's almost stunned into silence and he's wondering what's going on. What did you make of Will Buckley's reaction to that recitation by Allen Ginsberg? The couple of minutes where he's completely stunned into silence. What was your take on his expression?
I thought it was fascinating because, William Buckley Jr. is a conservative intellectual. He's a young conservative intellectual, perhaps one of the leading lights of that time. This is a television debate. The whole of America is watching these television debates, right? They are debating on real time, something that's tearing their country apart, right? And William Buckley Jr. represents the intellectual might, the young intellectual might of American conservatism, right? And he's, as you say, stunned into silence. He has never heard something like this before. To me, it seemed, and it immediately struck me how unfamiliar the West remained then or was then. Ironically, the West is as unfamiliar even today to even the fundamental ideas that emanate from India, right? So a lot of Western analysis is crafted upon so little understanding of the messages of India, the philosophical messages of India, that, that silence, one could write a full essay about the silence of William Buckley Jr., right? This lack of understanding, if you really want to understand the gap between the West and the East, that gap is in those 2 minutes of silence or a few minutes of silence, right? Because the context is different. In order to have an argument, if I were to argue with you, Siddhartha, on something, we have to at least agree on the fundamentals, right? I cannot be arguing about a tree and you cannot be arguing about a cat. That makes no sense. We at least have to say that we are both arguing about cats or trees. But in this particular case, one person is talking about cats and another person is talking about trees, so to speak. That gap is the intellectual gap of understanding between the India and the West. And I want to end this answer by telling you that, in my opinion, all of colonialism, certainly colonialism in Asia and India, is based on that gap. That silence is the foundation of all colonialism.
Sticking to the propagation of the Krishna consciousness and the kind of momentum that it acquired in both the United States and the United Kingdom, you also, of course, talk in detail about why London was so crucial for the expansion of these beliefs, because that also was a fertile ground. You talk about Enoch Powell and his River of Blood speech as well, and the anti-immigration sentiment at that point in time that was prevailing in the United Kingdom. But a slightly objective question on the strategy that was also deployed on the ground by Srila Prabhupada to expand the idea of Krishna consciousness. Another very important member of all of this, of course, was George Harrison of the Beatles. Right. But you do also mention, Dr. Sengupta, that Srila Prabhupada also kind of reached out to the Beatles because he understood how important they were to the expansion of the propagation of his ideas. You do also mention in one specific instance of how George Harrison offered to buy a large property for the establishment of a certain ISKCON entity, and the members of ISKCON were only too keen to have George Harrison do that. So therefore, a question that arises is that sure, yes, you were winning a lot of recruits because of the strength of what you were actually propagating. How much of this, if I may objectively put it, was also transactional in nature?
No, I don't think it was transactional in nature as much as it was propagational in nature. There is no doubt that after the America experience, the ISKCON movement understood the value of champions, of ambassadors, right? And because the Mahamantra itself is essentially music, right? It is a chant, right? To reach out to the most influential musicians of its time in the West would be a natural propagation, right? And remember, some of this strategization was actually being done not by Srila Prabhupada, but in a sense under his guidance by the Western disciples. Because Srila Prabhupada didn't know Allen Ginsberg or George Harrison, and it's not like he was listening to the Beatles and so on and so forth. It is his pupils who knew and understood their societies, and who realized that, okay, if we can impress these people, or if we can pass on the message to these people, they would be the greatest ambassadors, right? And that makes perfect sense, because Srila Prabhupada had taught them that this is a message that should go to every individual, right? And more so to individuals who can then further amplify that message. So choosing the Beatles and George Harrison, who was already interested in spirituality, the Beatles were interested in spirituality, Hindu spirituality, was a no-brainer, right? And it of course works. And as I mentioned in the book, not only just George Harrison, but even Yoko Ono and John Lennon interact with Srila Prabhupada, and so on and so forth, right? So that was a no-brainer. So I think the propagational idea that one should reach out to the biggest names of its time are absolutely true, and that's obviously something that was done. Now, obviously, these pupils wouldn't have known whether this could work or not. It is the power of the message itself that it worked, and worked beautifully on George Harrison, who, of course, then finally bought that estate, which you were mentioning, now called the Bhakti Vedanta Manor, which exists even today and is a great site for the work of ISKCON in England.
My next question is, of course, the divisions that cropped up within the ISKCON movement after Srila Prabhupada had managed to kind of succeed in expanding its reach to different parts of the world. Why do you believe that he felt at one point in time that there was an attempt to replace him, and that some of the others, recruits within the movement, had kind of sought to appropriate his legacy?
Well, for the simple reason that, Siddharth, I think that Srila Prabhupada didn't have enough time with many of his pupils. He had only worked on them for a few years, essentially. And he had a global movement to run, and many of those people who did not come from India, did not have the sort of context of India, had risen to very high ranks within the movement and began to run the movement, so to speak, which then involved, vast amounts of money and, estates and so on and so forth, right? And I think Srila Prabhupada felt at some point that there was some pupils wanted, because he was already very elderly and infirm, that perhaps they thought as far more younger people, they could take the movement forward. And he realized that, if that happens, the spiritual core of the movement will disappear, because they were not ready. His pupils were not ready, right? And therefore, he then, works to figure out like a small bunch of pupils who would then take his legacy forward, right? These are institutional problems. I mentioned at the end of the book, by the end of Srila Prabhupada's life, he's obviously constantly wanting to go away from these institutional things and moving deeper and deeper to his core spirituality. But there was a global movement and it had to run. And so he was constantly sort of trying to juggle these two.
The legacy of ISKCON, how would you now sum it up, especially after Srila Prabhupada's death in the year 1977? How do you think ISKCON has evolved following his death, and have his disciples managed to continue his legacy in the manner in which he would have wanted? And where do you see the movement now going forward?
So let me answer it in two ways, Siddhartha. As a researcher and a historian, my work has, of course, been till the end of the life of Srila Prabhupada, right? I cannot claim that I have researched about ISKCON, and maybe there's another book there post Srila Prabhupada, right? So it would be unfair for me to suggest that I know that part in greater detail. However, from whatever I know and whatever is commonplace knowledge, right, ISKCON did go through a period of great turbulence because of various reasons after the death of Srila Prabhupada. Today, I think ISKCON is at a very interesting moment once again. You see, and let me say this with a little bit of context, theological context. The figure of Krishna and the importance of the Bhagavad Gita is particularly resonant once again, right? In various ways, as a philosophical text, as a strategic text, Krishna as a figure, a theological, socio-political figure, all of this is tremendously alive in us once again, right? Perhaps it had sort of got diluted a little bit in between, but all of this is extremely potently among us again. And I think the figure of Krishna, and a lot of my, work now is I'm trying to understand Krishna. The theological figure of Krishna as the divine Godhead, so to speak. Very little work has been done in depth on this, right? And I think Osho wrote a book on Krishna. It's an interesting book, but I think it's at a particular level, much more can be said about this. And because of all these reasons, which I just elucidated, the importance of ISKCON and Srila Prabhupada himself is set to grow in importance, and I think a reinvention or reimagination of ISKCON and Srila Prabhupada is underway, especially because there is a real need and understanding to understand the figure of Krishna. And I think that is very potent and interesting. And I think in the years to come, you will see a lot more work will happen on this. Certainly, I intend to do a lot more work on this. And you will see a far deeper understanding of this movement of Krishna as a divine figurehead, and indeed of Srila Prabhupada himself.
One last question, and it's slightly speculative in nature. Given what we're witnessing in 21st century in India, would somebody like a Srila Prabhupada have endorsed the fusion of the Hindu religion with politics, or as an instrument of political mobilization? What do you think his views would have been on something like that?
So I think Srila Prabhupada is an extremely wise man, understood that all faith has a political element. All faith. Let me be a little prosaic and say, even people's blind faith on their football teams has a political element, right? So how can something like theology, like, religious faith not have a political element? The question always is, how do you manage that political element? What do you do with that political element? How do you contain that political element? How do you separate it and nuance it from the deep devotional side of spirituality, the inner side of spirituality, right? Those are questions. And I think Srila Prabhupada, being a great communicator, would have loved to be part of this ferment today, to give his point of view, to tell people how he saw this, from a very unique perspective. I think Srila Prabhupada is a tremendous communicator, the builder of one of the biggest, book publishing empires the world has ever seen, the Bhakti Vedanta Book Trust, would be a natural candidate in the age of social media to serve, his Lord Krishna through every means possible, including technology and social media, and as a communicator to give his perspective. So I think he would have really enjoyed being part of it, and he would have had very interesting perspectives to it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Sengupta, for speaking to us on Turning the Page. Many congratulations once again on your book, Sing, Dance and Pray. And I hope we get an opportunity to reconnect once again to discuss some of your other books as well on Turning the Page. So thank you so much for spending your time.
With great pleasure, Siddhartha. With great pleasure. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed our conversation, and thank you for some very interesting questions. Many of the questions you asked me, I've done many interviews on this book, but several questions that you asked me have not in fact been asked of me in any of the other interviews. And I thank you for your deep reading and understanding of the subject I attempted to tackle in Sing, Dance and Pray. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sengupta. Wish you well, and let's get in touch once again. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye then.
Bye. Thank you.